The small town of Black Hollow had always been quiet, the kind of place where the most excitement came from a high school football game or a town fair. But that peace had been shattered overnight. The house at the edge of town, once a home filled with warmth, was now a crime scene soaked in horror. The bodies of Matthew and Claire Lawson lay motionless in their bedroom, their flesh carved with a grotesque symbol that no one recognized. Blood had dried on the wooden floor in long, chaotic streaks, as if they had tried to crawl away before death finally claimed them. But the most disturbing detail wasn't the brutality of their deaths, it was what had been left behind. A single black feather, placed neatly between them, like a signature. Sheriff Thomas Grayson stood at the scene, his weathered face pale under the flickering ceiling light. He had seen death before, but not like this. Not since him. The symbol carved into the victims sent a sickening wave of déjà vu through his mind. He didn't need to say it out loud. The whispers had already begun. "He's back," one of the deputies muttered under his breath. Grayson turned sharply, his voice low and firm. "We don't jump to conclusions. Understood?" But deep down, he knew the truth. They had seen this before. Black Hollow had spent years trying to forget, trying to believe that the nightmare had ended. But nightmares never truly end. Evelyn Hart stepped out of her car, staring up at the dimly lit Black Hollow Inn. She pulled her coat tighter around her body as the cold wind howled through the nearly empty streets. She had driven 6 hours to get here, chasing the scent of something dark, something no other journalist had dared to touch. Murders this gruesome didn't happen in places like this. At least, they weren't supposed to. She had read the reports. 2 bodies, mutilated beyond recognition, a symbol carved into their flesh, and a black feather. That detail had struck her the most. It felt deliberate, ritualistic, personal. Inside the inn, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and burning firewood. The receptionist, an older woman with deep lines etched into her face, barely looked up as Evelyn checked in. "You're here for them, aren't you?" she asked. Evelyn hesitated. "The murders?" The woman nodded, lowering her voice. "You shouldn't be." Before Evelyn could respond, a heavy bootstep sounded behind her. She turned to see Sheriff Grayson, his expression unreadable. "Miss Hart, you're making a mistake coming here," he said. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "You don't even know why I'm here." Grayson scoffed. "You're a journalist. I know exactly why you're here." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen to me. Leave. This isn't just some crime story. You don't understand what you're dealing with." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Then help me understand." A muscle in Grayson's jaw tightened. "No." And with that, he walked away, leaving Evelyn standing there with more questions than answers. That night, Evelyn found herself outside the Lawson house. The police tape fluttered in the wind, but the door had been left slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the silence was suffocating. She moved carefully through the darkened house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She reached the bedroom, and her stomach twisted at the sight. The dried blood, the unnatural way the bodies had been positioned, and there, in the center of it all, the black feather. Something crunched under her boot. She looked down and saw a leather-bound journal, half-dried blood smeared across the cover. Evelyn picked it up, her pulse pounding. She flipped through the pages, her breath catching as she reached the final entry. Scrawled in what looked like blood, a single name stood out, its letters jagged and uneven, as if written in terror. Darius Wraith. The air suddenly felt heavier, pressing against her chest. The sound of the wind outside had died, replaced by something else. A whisper, a breath just behind her. She spun around, and the lights went out. The pages of the journal were stiff with dried blood, the ink smeared in places as if written in frantic desperation. Evelyn sat at the small desk in her motel room, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Her fingers trembled as she turned the brittle pages, absorbing the twisted thoughts of a man consumed by darkness. Each entry felt like a descent into madness, a slow unraveling of a mind that had once belonged to someone human but had become something else entirely. The words on the page spoke of death not as an end but as a transformation, a passage beyond the limitations of the flesh. Darius Wraith believed in something ancient, something beyond human comprehension, and he had devoted his life to it. The ritual he described was unlike anything Evelyn had ever encountered, a series of gruesome acts meant to tear through the veil between worlds. The victims were not just chosen at random. They were marked, their blood the ink used to write a story that had been unfolding for decades. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she read a chilling passage where Darius described the necessity of the killings, how each death brought him closer to his goal. The words were feverish, almost reverent, as he detailed the sacrifices needed to complete his work. He spoke of a black sun rising, of shadows that moved on their own, of whispers that only the chosen could hear. He claimed to have seen beyond the mortal world, to have glimpsed something waiting in the darkness, something hungry. He wrote that the killings must continue, that only by completing the ritual could he bring forth the one who spoke to him in dreams. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared as if written in frantic desperation. The words overlapped, but one phrase stood out among the chaos. The cycle begins again. The first mark has been made. The black sun is coming. Evelyn's heart pounded as she realized what this meant. This was not just the ramblings of a madman. It was a prophecy. The murders had started again because the ritual was unfinished. Darius Wraith was not just a killer. He was something worse, something with a purpose that went beyond simple bloodlust. The victims were chosen, their deaths part of a larger design. But what was it leading to? She needed answers, and there was only one place to start. Father Marcus's church sat at the far end of town, its ancient stone walls weathered by time. The priest had lived in this town longer than anyone and had seen things most people refused to acknowledge. When Evelyn mentioned Darius Wraith's name, his expression darkened. His fingers tightened around the cross hanging from his neck, his body going rigid as if the very name carried a weight too heavy to bear. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the unspoken warning. But she had come too far to turn back now. She pressed him for answers, refusing to let him brush her off like the others had. He exhaled sharply, his voice low when he finally spoke. "You shouldn't be digging into this." Evelyn met his gaze, her hands tightening into fists. "People are dying. I don't have a choice." Father Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as if battling some internal war. For a long moment, he said nothing, and then his shoulders sagged, and something inside him broke. Darius Wraith wasn't born a monster. He was made into one. The priest's voice was heavy with sorrow as he told her about a boy raised in isolation, forced to witness horrors no child should ever see. His father had been a cultist, a man obsessed with the idea of transcending death, of opening a door to something beyond. Darius had been subjected to rituals, taught from a young age that pain was a gift, that suffering was sacred. He had been molded into something unnatural, something no longer entirely human. The killings weren't just about death. They were about transformation, about completing a ritual that had begun decades ago. Evelyn felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she realized what this meant. This wasn't just a serial killer. This was something else, something far worse. The sheriff had been searching for a man, but he had been hunting a ghost, a shadow that moved through the town without leaving a trace. And now, after years of silence, the killings had started again. That meant the ritual was unfinished, that Darius had returned to complete what he had started. That night, Evelyn sat at her motel window, staring into the darkness. The weight of what she had learned pressed against her chest like a physical force. She felt the pulse of fear in her veins, the knowledge that she was walking a path from which there was no return. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the glass. She told herself it was nothing, just the town playing tricks on her. But then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Her breath hitched, her body frozen in place. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with an unseen presence. She reached for the curtain, hesitated, then pulled it back. The street was empty. The shadows stretched long beneath the flickering street lamp, shifting as if something had just moved beyond her sight. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, that she was letting paranoia get the best of her. But then her eyes dropped to the ground, and her blood ran cold. There, placed with careful intent on her doorstep, was a single black feather. Her body went rigid, her heartbeat a thunderous roar in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to move, to lock the door, to grab her phone and call someone. Anyone. But before she could react, the motel phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the silence like a blade. The sound sent a jolt of fear through her, but she forced herself to move, to pick up the receiver with shaking fingers. For a moment, there was nothing, just breathing, shallow, raspy. Then, a voice, distorted, inhuman. "You shouldn't have come here." The line went dead. The silence that followed the call was almost worse than the voice itself. Evelyn stood frozen, the motel phone still clutched in her trembling fingers, her pulse thudding against her skull. The distorted whisper echoed in her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a suffocating fog. "You shouldn't have come here." The words felt like a warning, but also a promise, an omen of something that had already begun, something she couldn't stop now. For several long moments, she simply stood there, forcing herself to breathe, to move past the paralysis gripping her body. When she finally found the strength to lower the receiver, she turned her attention back to the window. The black feather on her doorstep was still there, an unmistakable sign that someone, Darius, or whoever was working in his name, had been watching her. But how had they gotten so close without her noticing? The motel was quiet, its hallways empty save for the occasional creak of settling wood. She reached for her phone, checking for any unknown numbers. Nothing. No record of the call. It was as if it had never happened. That wasn't possible. Someone had called. Someone had spoken to her. Sleep was out of the question. Evelyn spent the next few hours combing through old newspaper clippings, desperate to make sense of the pattern. The journal had revealed that the murders stretched back decades, but she needed more. Something tangible, something that could lead her to Darius. Her fingers hovered over her laptop keyboard, searching archives until her eyes blurred from exhaustion. And then, buried in an article from 20 years ago, she found a name that sent a chill racing down her spine. Darius Wraith had once been a mortician. She leaned closer, reading the old report. It detailed a scandal in the small town. A respected mortician accused of desecrating graves, stealing bodies from the morgue. No one had ever been able to prove it, but whispers of strange rituals and missing corpses had followed Darius until, one day, he simply vanished. The accusations had never been resolved, and the case faded into local legend, becoming little more than a ghost story. But now Evelyn knew the truth. He hadn't disappeared. He had been waiting. The mortuary still stood, though abandoned for years, a decaying relic on the outskirts of town. By the time Evelyn arrived, dawn had barely begun to paint the horizon. The building loomed over her, its windows dark and empty like gaping mouths. The air around it was heavy, damp with the scent of rot and something deeper, something older. A rusted chain looped through the front doors, but it had already been cut. Recently, by the look of it. Someone had been here before her. Stepping inside, she was greeted by the stale, choking scent of dust and forgotten things. The room was exactly what she had expected. An abandoned reception area, old furniture draped in sheets, a ledger of names yellowed with age. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her cautious steps. She moved deeper into the building, past rusted gurneys and shattered glass, her flashlight slicing through the gloom. Then she found it. A hidden door, partially obscured by a collapsed shelf. It had been forced open, the edges scraped raw as if someone had pried their way inside. Holding her breath, Evelyn stepped through. The room beyond was unlike anything she had seen before. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with items that sent ice through her veins. Jars containing unidentifiable remains, wax-sealed envelopes filled with brittle bones, old photographs of people who no longer existed. An altar stood in the center, its surface carved with the same cryptic symbol that had been etched into the victim's flesh. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a shrine. She stepped closer, trying to take in every detail. Someone had been using this space recently. The dust had been disturbed, footprints trailing across the floor in patterns too precise to be random. But who? And why? A sound. A whisper of movement behind her. Evelyn spun around, her flashlight beam shaking as it cut through the darkness. A figure stood in the farthest corner of the room, half shrouded in shadow. Tall, unmoving, its presence thick and suffocating. Her breath hitched. She wanted to move, to run, but her body refused to listen. The darkness around the figure seemed to shift, like ink bleeding into the air, like it wasn't entirely solid. Its face was obscured, its form barely distinguishable, but she could feel its gaze, piercing, unrelenting. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Evelyn gasped, stumbling backward, her hands shaking. Her flashlight flickered, the air in the room growing colder, heavier. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she really seen someone? Or had she finally let the fear take over? Her eyes dropped to the altar, to the single item that hadn't been there before. A black feather. And beside it, a note. The words were scrawled in sharp, jagged handwriting, the ink smeared as if written in haste. "You're getting closer." The air in the hidden room felt heavier now, pressing down on Evelyn's chest like unseen hands. Her fingers trembled as she lifted one of the old photographs from the altar. The image was faded, edges curled with time, but the horror it depicted was unmistakable. A woman, her eyes wide with terror, mouth twisted in a silent scream. Deep cuts marred her flesh, each one forming the same cryptic symbol carved into the victims found in town. Evelyn shuffled through the rest of the photos, her breath quickening as she recognized the pattern. Every single person in these images had been murdered in the same ritualistic manner, and beneath each photograph, a date. Some stretched back decades, others more recent. The cycle had never ended. Darius had been killing for years. Her hands brushed against something else. Paper, yellowed and brittle. A map. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes darting over the chaotic markings scrawled across the surface. Red circles surrounded certain locations, most of them deep in the woods surrounding the town. Each marked site corresponded with a murder. But there was something else, a location that hadn't been reported in the news. One final mark, different from the others, darker, more deliberate. The ink seemed fresher. A future victim? The thought sent a cold shiver racing down her spine. The whisper came again, low, guttural, curling in the air like smoke. Evelyn stiffened, gripping her flashlight tighter as she turned toward the sound. The room was empty, no sign of the shadowy figure from before, but she could feel something watching her. She wasn't alone. The temperature in the mortuary plummeted, breath escaping her lips in wisps of condensation. A sudden crash from behind sent her spinning around, her heart leaping into her throat. A rusted metal tray clattered to the ground, rolling to a slow stop. Evelyn took a step back, pulse hammering against her ribs. And then the whispering stopped. Silence swallowed the room. Something shifted in the corner. She didn't stay to find out what. Panic surged through her veins, and she turned on her heel, sprinting toward the door. The unseen presence followed, a pressure against her back, an oppressive force pressing closer. Evelyn burst into the hallway, nearly tripping over debris as she tore through the darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the distant echoes of footsteps matching her own, too close, too fast. The front doors loomed ahead, the only escape. She lunged for them. As she crossed the threshold, an icy hand, unseen but real, brushed against her shoulder. A scream tore from her throat as she stumbled into the open air, collapsing onto the dirt outside. Gasping, she scrambled to her feet, expecting to see someone, or something, chasing after her. But the doorway stood empty, the shadows within thick and unyielding. The mortuary was silent once more. Still trembling, Evelyn forced herself away, her pulse refusing to settle even as she reached her car. The unease clung to her like damp air, and even as she started the engine and sped away, she knew she hadn't escaped. Whatever was inside that mortuary wasn't finished with her yet. She drove straight to the sheriff's office, her mind reeling with everything she had found. Sheriff Grayson looked up as she stormed in, his face immediately darkening at her disheveled appearance. "You went to the mortuary," he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn slammed the photos and map onto his desk. "You knew, didn't you? About Darius, about the murders from decades ago. You knew this wasn't over." Grayson's jaw tightened. He stared down at the pictures, his fingers brushing the edges of the aged photographs. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice lower than before, he muttered, "I knew Darius Wraith before he became a monster." Evelyn's breath caught. The sheriff exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, as if years of unspoken secrets had suddenly become too heavy to bear. "We were kids," he admitted, voice rough. "He wasn't always like this. He wasn't always lost." Evelyn's mind raced. How could the town sheriff, the man tasked with stopping Darius, have once called him a friend? She was about to press him for more when the phone on his desk rang, shattering the tension. Grayson answered, his expression immediately shifting. "What?" His fingers curled around the receiver, gripped tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Evelyn didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation to know something was terribly wrong. When Grayson finally spoke again, his voice was hollow. "It's your sister, Evelyn." A cold dread settled in her gut. "She's missing." Evelyn barely registered moving, barely heard Grayson calling after her as she rushed out of the office, her heart slamming against her ribs. The drive to her motel was a blur, headlights slicing through the darkness as she sped through the quiet streets. By the time she arrived, the door to her room was already open, the lock broken. She stepped inside, her breath shallow. The room was empty, no sign of Lila. The air was thick with stillness, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And on the bed, placed carefully at the center of the pillow, lay a single black feather. The night pressed heavily around Evelyn as she stood frozen in the doorway of her motel room, staring at the black feather resting on her sister's pillow. The sight of it sent a violent shiver down her spine. The weight of dread settled in her chest, a suffocating pressure she couldn't shake. "Lila?" Her voice barely carried beyond her lips. No answer. The room was still, as if time itself had stopped. With shaking hands, she tore through the space, searching for any sign of struggle, any clue as to where her sister had gone. The bed was unmade, her suitcase still open with clothes spilling over the edge. It looked as if Lila had been mid-routine before vanishing. The thought of her sister being taken, of Darius taking her, was too much to bear. Evelyn dug into her pocket, yanking out her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed Grayson. The call went straight to voicemail. "Damn it," she hissed, shoving the phone back into her jacket. She had no time to wait. Evelyn forced herself to think. If Darius had taken Lila, where would he have taken her? The map. She darted back to her car, tearing down the road toward the sheriff's office. The moment she burst through the door, she spotted the map still sprawled across Grayson's desk. She scanned the locations, her pulse roaring in her ears. The mortuary, the woods, the lake, and then an old, faded marking just outside of town. The abandoned church. Evelyn barely remembered climbing back into her car. The world around her blurred, the road stretching into the endless dark. Her grip on the steering wheel was vice-like, her foot pressing harder on the gas pedal. If there was any chance Lila was still alive, she had to find her now. As she neared the outskirts of town, a strange sight made her stomach twist. Black feathers. They lined the side of the road like a grim breadcrumb trail, scattered in a path leading deeper into the trees. Her headlights caught the looming silhouette of the old church ahead. The building stood in eerie silence, its once proud structure now a crumbling shell of what it had been. The roof sagged, the stained glass windows were cracked, and the wooden doors hung slightly ajar. A deep sense of unease slithered through her veins as she approached. Stepping out of the car, Evelyn moved cautiously, the damp leaves crunching beneath her boots. The air smelled of decay, of something ancient and wrong. She pushed the doors open with a creak, the sound echoing into the cavernous space beyond. Inside, the church was dark except for the flickering of candlelight near the altar. Evelyn's breath caught as she took in the sight before her. Bones. They were arranged in a grotesque display, forming a twisted pattern on the stone floor. Candles flickered at the edges, their dim glow casting distorted shadows against the cracked walls. And at the center of it all, the same symbol carved into every victim's flesh, etched in dark, dried blood. A wave of nausea rolled through her. Then, she heard it. A whisper, low and distant at first, but growing louder, curling around her like smoke. The voice wove through the rafters, calling her name in a breathy rasp. Evelyn. She turned sharply, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. The darkness beyond the altar was thick, pulsing with unseen movement. Something was there, watching, waiting. Her stomach twisted in dread as she spotted something draped over one of the broken pews, a scarf. Lila's scarf. Heart pounding, Evelyn rushed forward and snatched it up. The fabric was torn, the edges frayed, and worst of all, stained with blood. A sharp gust of wind howled through the open doorway, snuffing out the candles in an instant. The church plunged into suffocating darkness. And then, from the depths of the black, came a sound that froze Evelyn where she stood. A slow, deliberate footstep. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the abandoned church, clutching Lila's blood-stained scarf in one hand and her flashlight in the other. The footsteps in the darkness had ceased, but the oppressive silence was even worse. She wasn't alone. Something was here, watching. Forcing herself to move, she crept toward the altar, her flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the grotesque display before her. The bones, the candles, the symbol. It all pointed to something far worse than she had imagined. And then she saw it. A book. A worn, leather-bound journal sat at the foot of the altar, half hidden beneath the scattered remains. The cover was cracked with age, but the name etched onto it sent a wave of cold dread through her veins. Darius Wraith. Evelyn hesitated only a second before snatching it up, flipping through the brittle pages. The handwriting was jagged, erratic, the words scrawled in a feverish frenzy. She skimmed through them, her pulse hammering in her ears as she absorbed the horrors detailed within. Death is not the end. Death is only the beginning. They do not understand, but I do. The ritual will bridge the gap between this world and the next. The chosen must be purified, must be given willingly. Only then will the door open. Only then will I return. She turned another page, her fingers trembling. Symbols she had seen carved into the victim's flesh were drawn with obsessive precision, each accompanied by detailed notes. And then, Lila's name. Evelyn's heart nearly stopped. She is the final piece. The blood offering. The one who will open the path. The journal slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud on the altar. The realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. If Darius truly believed in this ritual, if he was following it to the end, Lila didn't have much time left. A sudden creak behind her sent icy terror flooding through her chest. She spun around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, just in time to see a shadow detach itself from the wall. A figure, moving unnaturally, its presence sending a wave of suffocating dread through the air. Evelyn barely had time to react before it lunged. A cold, claw-like grip clamped onto her wrist, yanking her forward with unnatural strength. She let out a choked cry, struggling against the force dragging her toward the altar. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, spinning wildly across the stone floor, its beam flashing over glimpses of something she couldn't fully comprehend. Decayed flesh, hollow eyes, a face that was both human and inhuman. Evelyn kicked out, twisting desperately, her fingers scrambling across the altar. The edge of the journal brushed her fingertips, and in a last-ditch effort, she swung it blindly at the figure. It shrieked. The unearthly sound ripped through the church as the shadow recoiled, releasing her with a force that sent her sprawling to the ground. Without thinking, she grabbed the journal, bolted to her feet, and ran. The church doors slammed open before her as she burst into the night, lungs burning, heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door. Only when she was speeding down the empty road did she dare glance in the rearview mirror. The church was shrinking in the distance, but just before it vanished from sight, she saw it. a lone figure standing in the doorway, watching her leave. Sheriff Grayson's office was dimly lit when Evelyn barged inside, slamming the journal onto his desk. You knew. Her voice was shaking with rage. You knew about all of this and you said nothing. Grayson looked up from his chair, exhaustion and something else, something unreadable, darkening his features. Evelyn. Don't lie to me. Darius Wraith. He's not just some legend. He's real. And he's trying to kill my sister. Grayson exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. I was trying to protect you. By keeping me in the dark? By letting me walk into that goddamn church alone? He didn't answer. His silence was enough. Evelyn's hands curled into fists. The journal. He wrote about the ritual, about how it's supposed to bring him back. But the thing is, Darius never left, did he? She met Grayson's gaze, her voice dropping to a whisper. Tell me the truth. A heavy silence stretched between them. Finally, Grayson leaned forward, his eyes haunted. Darius Wraith was declared dead 20 years ago. His voice was hollow, laced with something close to regret. But the murders never stopped. Evelyn felt the world tilt beneath her. Because if Darius had been dead for 20 years, then what the hell had she just seen in that church? Evelyn stared at Sheriff Grayson, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. The revelation sent a chill through her bones. Darius Wraith had never truly died. The town had buried the truth, but the murders had continued, the horror never-ending. Grayson slumped back in his chair, looking years older. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a drawer, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and a glass. He poured himself a drink, but Evelyn snatched the bottle before he could lift it to his lips. You don't get to drown yourself in this, she snapped, her voice sharp with anger. You knew Grayson. You knew all along, and you did nothing. His tired eyes met hers. You think it was that simple? He leaned forward, his voice low and broken. I was 20 years old when I found Darius standing over a body, his hands covered in blood. It was a girl from town. A girl I grew up with. She was barely breathing, and Darius just stood there, smiling like he'd done something beautiful. Evelyn's stomach twisted. I should have turned him in, Grayson continued. But I didn't. I helped him clean it up. I told myself I was protecting the town. That if people found out we had a killer in our midst, it would destroy us. I was a coward. His jaw clenched. But Darius didn't stop. And by the time I realized what he really was, it was too late. Evelyn swallowed the bile rising in her throat. The mortuary fire. Grayson nodded slowly. I thought he died that night. We all did. But the bodies kept turning up. No one ever saw him. No one ever caught him. But the symbols, the black feathers, they never stopped. Evelyn turned away, her mind racing. All this time, Grayson had been living in fear, knowing that Darius was out there, lurking in the shadows, taking lives while the town turned a blind eye. Something caught her eye, a framed photo on the sheriff's desk. It was old, the edges worn and yellowed with time. 3 young boys stood in front of an old house, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. The boy in the middle had his face scratched out with deep, angry gouges, but the other 2, one was Grayson, the other was Darius. A slow sense of unease crawled up Evelyn's spine. Who's the third boy? Grayson didn't answer. Evelyn grabbed the frame, pointing at the damaged face. Who is he, Grayson? A long silence. Then, barely above a whisper, Father Marcus. Evelyn's breath hitched. The priest who had reluctantly shared information about Darius. The man who had been wary, hesitant, hiding something. The same man who had told her to stop looking. Before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the station. Both of them stiffened. It was nearly midnight. No one should have been there. Grayson reached for his gun, motioning for Evelyn to stay back as he moved toward the door. He hesitated for only a second before yanking it open. No one was there. Just a small, unmarked package sitting on the ground. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she reached for it, the weight of dread pressing down on her chest. With shaking hands, she tore the paper away, her breath catching in her throat as the contents spilled into her palm. A lock of Lila's hair. And a note, written in that same jagged, erratic handwriting. Time is running out. The world tilted, panic seizing Evelyn's chest as her vision blurred. Lila was still alive, but not for much longer. Evelyn stormed into the dimly lit church, her heart hammering in her chest. Father Marcus stood near the altar, his face pale and hollow, as if he had been expecting her. The scent of burning candles filled the air, but beneath it, Evelyn could almost smell something rotten, something decayed. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You knew," she snapped, her voice sharp with accusation. "You knew all along." Marcus closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out." Evelyn slammed the note and lock of Lila's hair onto the wooden pew between them. "She's going to die unless you start talking. No more riddles, no more warnings. Tell me everything." The priest hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the altar. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, his shoulders sagged. "I was part of it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cult." Evelyn's breath caught. "I was young," Marcus continued, his hands trembling. "Barely 15. Darius. He had a way of drawing people in, making them believe in something bigger, something dark. He told us death wasn't the end, that he could reach beyond the veil, bring back those we lost. He promised us eternity." Evelyn's stomach twisted in disgust. "You helped him kill people." Marcus's face contorted with shame. "Not at first, but I watched. I let it happen, until it was too late to stop." He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "The ritual, it was never finished. Darius needed 7 souls, but we only made it to 5 before the fire at the mortuary." Evelyn clenched her fists, anger boiling inside her. "And now Lila is the 6th. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "He's waited 20 years to complete what he started." A deep, suffocating silence filled the room as the weight of his words settled over them. Evelyn took a slow step forward. "Where is he?" The priest hesitated. "I don't know." "Don't lie to me." Marcus exhaled shakily. "I only have a clue. Something I found years ago, but never had the courage to follow." He turned and moved toward his office, pulling open an old wooden drawer. From inside, he retrieved a folded, yellowed map. He placed it on the table and smoothed it out, revealing a series of faded markings. One spot was circled in deep red ink. Black Hollow Asylum. Evelyn's skin prickled. "What is this place?" "A burial ground," Marcus whispered. "For the forgotten. For the ones who never made it out." A sick feeling crawled up Evelyn's spine. Before she could ask anything more, a cold gust of wind swept through the church, snuffing out the candles. The room plunged into darkness. A wet, gasping sound filled the silence. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She reached for her phone, flipping on the flashlight. Marcus was on his knees, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven gasps. Blood. It seeped through his robes, staining the front of his shirt. Evelyn rushed forward, pressing her hands against the deep carving in his chest. The same cryptic symbol Darius had left on every victim. Marcus's lips moved, a single, breathless whisper escaping before his body slumped lifelessly to the floor. "Run." Evelyn stumbled back, her vision blurring. The church was silent again. But on the altar, where Marcus had been standing just moments ago, a single black feather rested against the blood-stained wood. Evelyn gripped the wheel tightly as she and Sheriff Grayson drove down the desolate road leading to Black Hollow Asylum. The headlights barely cut through the dense fog that coiled around the trees like ghostly tendrils. The silence between them was heavy, weighed down by the horrors they both knew awaited them. "This place was shut down decades ago," Grayson muttered, his gaze locked on the decaying structure emerging from the darkness. "After too many disappearances, too many accidents." Evelyn swallowed hard. The asylum loomed before them, its skeletal remains standing against the night like a monument to madness. The windows were shattered, the walls covered in vines, and the entrance hung open, as if inviting them inside. They stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching against the overgrown gravel. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed forward, flashlight in one hand. the other resting on the cold steel of the small knife she had tucked into her pocket. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Peeling wallpaper curled like dead skin from the walls, and broken wheelchairs and rusted gurneys lined the corridors. Old patient files littered the floor, some pages smeared with something dark and dried. "This place is hell," Grayson murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn bent down, picking up a file with a familiar name scrawled across it in faded ink. Darius Wraith. She flipped it open. The words sent a chill racing down her spine. Committed at age 13. Severe delusions. Obsession with the dead. Displays signs of violent tendencies. Unfit for release. A shrill scream cut through the silence. "Lila!" Evelyn bolted down the hall, her pulse hammering as her sister's cries echoed through the asylum. "Lila!" she shouted, her voice raw. They followed the sound through the labyrinthine corridors, past abandoned operating rooms filled with rusted surgical tools and old restraints. The screams grew louder, leading them deeper into the asylum's rotting core. And then, silence. Evelyn froze. A slow, deliberate tapping came from the darkness ahead. A rhythmic sound, like fingernails drumming against wood. Her flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Then a voice. Soft. Amused. "You came." Evelyn's breath hitched. From the shadows, Darius Wraith emerged. His presence was suffocating, his frame tall and gaunt, his face concealed behind an old, plague doctor-like mask. He tilted his head slightly, as if examining her. "You've been searching for me," he mused, his voice laced with a quiet amusement. "I've been searching for you too." Evelyn's grip tightened on her flashlight. "Where is Lila?" Darius took a slow step forward. "She's exactly where she needs to be." Rage flared in Evelyn's chest. She lunged, but Darius stepped back into the shadows, his laughter echoing through the asylum like a ghostly melody. The lights overhead flickered, and suddenly, the walls were covered in something new. Photos. Dozens of them. Evelyn stepped closer, her stomach twisting in horror. The pictures weren't of Lila. They were of her. Years of images. Some from her childhood, some from her time in college. Some as recent as last week. A slow realization crawled over her skin like ice. Darius Wraith had been watching her for years. The asylum felt like a living entity, its walls breathing with secrets and whispers that clawed at Evelyn's mind. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something darker, something rotten. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the photographs plastered across the walls. Her own face, frozen in time, captured in moments she never knew were being watched. She took a shaky step back. How long had Darius been following her? How had he known she would come to this town? A rusted filing cabinet stood against the far wall, its drawers slightly ajar. She hesitated, then yanked one open. Inside, old VHS tapes were stacked neatly, each labeled in Darius's jagged handwriting. One name made her stomach drop. Lila. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the tape and found an old TV in the corner of the room. The screen buzzed to life with static before an image flickered on. Darius stood in a dimly lit room, his masked face inches from the camera. Behind him, Lila was tied to a wooden chair, her mouth gagged, her eyes wide with terror. She struggled against her restraints, but her muffled screams were drowned by Darius's voice. "The final piece," he murmured, caressing Lila's hair. "The ritual is nearly complete. Soon, they will come." The screen cut to black. Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts. She had to find Lila. Now, she turned toward Grayson, who was still scanning the room, his jaw clenched tight. "We need to move." A shadow moved. Before she could react, something heavy struck Grayson from behind. He crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Evelyn spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Darius stood in the doorway, his mask tilted slightly as if amused by her reaction. He didn't speak. He only lifted a single black feather and let it drift to the ground. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness of the asylum. Evelyn dropped to her knees beside Grayson. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. "Stay with me," she whispered. But she knew he was too injured to continue. She was alone now. Pushing past the terror gnawing at her insides, Evelyn grabbed her flashlight and followed Darius's trail through the asylum's decaying hallways. Each step echoed ominously, the shadows around her stretching and shifting. The path led her to a massive set of iron doors. They creaked open with an agonized groan, revealing a dimly lit chamber lined with mirrors. Hundreds of them. Each one reflected her pale face, her wide eyes. But something was wrong. In every reflection, a figure loomed behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. A cold breath ghosted over her neck. Then, from the mirrors, Darius's voice slithered through the room. "You're right where I want you." Evelyn's scream was swallowed by the darkness. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she spun in place, surrounded by countless reflections of herself. The mirrors stretched from floor to ceiling, their surfaces rippling like water, distorting her face into grotesque, shifting versions of herself. And in each one, Darius stood behind her, his mask shifting, his eyes hollow voids of endless black. "Do you know why you're here, Evelyn?" His voice slithered through the room, though his true form remained unseen. She clenched her fists. "Where is my sister?" A cruel chuckle echoed. "She's waiting. But before you reach her, you need to see the truth." The mirrors shimmered, and suddenly, Evelyn wasn't staring at herself anymore. She was looking into the past. Her childhood bedroom appeared, bathed in the dim glow of a night light. A younger version of herself sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Her mother stood in the doorway, whispering words Evelyn couldn't quite hear. Then, without warning, the memory shifted. A scream. A pool of blood. Her mother's lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth. "No, stop. You've spent your whole life running from this," Darius whispered from the void. "But you and I, we're the same. We were shaped by death." The scene in the mirror changed again. This time, it showed Evelyn's past investigations, every dark case, every horrifying discovery. And in the background of each, hidden just beyond her sight, was Darius. He had been watching her for years. Rage ignited inside her. She grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the nearest mirror, shattering the glass. Shards rained down, but instead of reflecting her, the fragments showed something else, a hidden passage beyond the broken mirror. A gust of cold air swept through the opening, carrying with it a sound that made Evelyn's blood freeze. Lila's scream. Heart pounding, she plunged through the jagged opening, following the cries down a narrow stone passageway. The walls pulsed as if alive, the darkness pressing in, suffocating. The air thickened with the scent of damp earth and burning wax. Then, she emerged into a vast, candlelit chamber. At the center stood an ancient stone altar, surrounded by symbols carved deep into the floor. Black candles flickered, their flames casting eerie shadows. And at the altar, bound and trembling, was Lila. Darius stood over her, a gleaming knife in his hand. His mask caught the candlelight, giving the illusion of a grinning skull. "You're just in time," he murmured, lifting the blade over Lila's chest. Evelyn's scream shattered the silence. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stepped toward the altar, her eyes locked onto the jagged blade in Darius's hand. Lila's terrified eyes met hers, pleading without words, her wrists bound by thick, frayed rope. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows, distorting the room into something even more nightmarish. "You don't have to do this," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady, though every instinct screamed at her to act. "This won't bring her back." Darius turned his head slightly, his mask shifting as he exhaled slowly. "You don't understand," he murmured. "She was taken from me, ripped away. But the ritual, it will make things right." His voice was eerily calm, as if he truly believed in the horrors he was about to commit. Evelyn saw it now. He wasn't just a killer. He was a man utterly consumed by his grief, his obsession. "This isn't what she would have wanted," Evelyn pressed. "Killing Lila won't bring your mother back. You know that." Darius's grip on the knife tightened. "You think I haven't tried everything else?" His voice cracked, the first sign of true emotion breaking through his cold exterior. This is the only way. Blood for blood. Before Evelyn could react, he slashed downward. Lila shrieked, jerking away just in time to avoid the blade. Evelyn lunged, grabbing Darius's wrist and twisting with all her strength. The knife clattered against the stone floor, but before she could pull Lila free, Darius struck her across the face. She stumbled back, her vision bursting with white-hot stars. Pain exploded in her jaw. The next moment, he was on top of her, hands closing around her throat. "You were never supposed to be part of this," Darius hissed, his weight pressing down, his grip tightening. Evelyn clawed at his hands, gasping, the edges of her vision darkening. She fought against the burning in her lungs, the sheer strength of him keeping her pinned. A gunshot shattered the air. Darius roared in pain, jerking back. Blood bloomed across his shoulder, his body staggering away from Evelyn. Sheriff Grayson stood at the entrance, his gun still raised. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and rage. "It's over, Darius," he growled. Darius swayed, one hand clutching his bleeding shoulder. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might collapse. But then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps fading down an unseen passage. Evelyn coughed, sucking in desperate breaths. She scrambled toward Lila, cutting through the ropes with trembling hands. Lila threw her arms around her, sobbing. I thought I was going to die." Evelyn held her tight. "Not today." Sheriff Grayson limped toward them, his face grim. "He won't get far. He's losing too much blood." But as Evelyn looked toward the dark corridor where Darius had vanished, she saw them. Black feathers scattered across the ground, leading deeper into the abyss. The scent of rust and decay filled the air as Evelyn and Sheriff Grayson moved through the darkened corridors of Black Hollow Asylum. Darius's blood trail gleamed under the dim beam of Grayson's flashlight, a gruesome breadcrumb path leading deeper into the belly of the forsaken institution. "He's weakening," Grayson muttered, his grip tightening around his revolver. "He won't make it far." Evelyn wasn't so sure. Darius had proven time and time again that he thrived in the shadows, in places forgotten by the world. He was more than a man. He was a phantom, a nightmare that had stalked this town for decades. They pressed forward, their footsteps echoing through the decrepit halls. The asylum groaned around them, its walls shifting like a living thing. A cold wind howled through shattered windows, whispering secrets of the past. Then, a loud click. Evelyn barely had time to react before the floor beneath her gave way. She let out a cry as she tumbled downward, arms flailing for something, anything, to grab onto. At the last second, she caught hold of a rusted pipe jutting from the wall, her body jerking to a sudden, painful stop. "Evelyn," Grayson called, dropping to his knees and reaching for her. I'm okay," she panted, her fingers slick with sweat and dust. She looked down. A row of jagged, rusted spikes gleamed in the darkness below, remnants of a sick trap set long ago. If she had fallen just a few feet more, Darius knew they were coming. He had planned for this. With a grunt of effort, Evelyn swung her legs, using the momentum to reach the crumbling edge of the pit. Grayson caught her hand, pulling her up just as the pipe gave way, tumbling into the abyss below. They locked eyes, breathless. No words needed to be exchanged. They both knew. Darius wasn't running. He was leading them. The blood trail continued down a side corridor, twisting through the remains of what once had been patient quarters. The walls were lined with rotting beds, yellowed sheets still tangled around their rusted frames. Shadows danced in the flickering emergency lights, giving the illusion of movement just beyond their reach. Then Evelyn saw it. A door left slightly ajar, the blood trail leading straight inside. She pushed it open, her breath catching in her throat. It was a shrine, a grotesque collection of trinkets and trophies, each one carefully arranged on dusty shelves. Lockets, wedding rings, children's shoes, photographs of people long forgotten, victims. She stepped closer, fingers trembling as they traced over the items. So many lives lost, so many names erased. And then she saw it. A photograph. A little girl playing outside, her arms outstretched toward the sun. Herself. A cold chill slithered down Evelyn's spine as her eyes drifted to the figure in the background. A man. Tall. Thin. Watching. Darius. A tremor ran through her body as realization settled in. He had been there. Watching. Waiting. Not just for her. For years. A slow, deliberate clap echoed from the doorway. Evelyn turned, her blood running cold. Darius stood in the shadows, his mask half broken, revealing a twisted grin. "Welcome home," he whispered. The room felt smaller, suffocating under the weight of the truth. Evelyn's grip tightened around the photograph, her knuckles white, but her focus remained on Darius. He stood motionless in the doorway, his presence warping the air around him like a living shadow. "You've been following me," she said, her voice low, controlled, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Darius tilted his head, that grotesque half-smile widening. "Not just you, Evelyn. Your whole life has been leading to this moment." Her breath hitched, but she refused to let fear win. "Why?" Darius let out a small chuckle, stepping forward, his boots clicking softly against the floor. "Because of your mother." Evelyn's stomach twisted violently. Darius's voice was eerily calm, almost reverent. "She was my first." Evelyn staggered back, her head spinning. "You're lying. I never lie about the ones I love." His fingers traced over a rusted metal shelf, brushing against the edges of another photograph. "She was beautiful, strong, just like you." Rage burned through Evelyn's veins, overtaking the nausea, threatening to consume her. "You killed her." Darius nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And she's been waiting ever since." Evelyn's mind reeled. "Waiting?" Darius grinned. "The ritual. It was never about just any sacrifices. It was about bringing back what was taken. Your mother is waiting for me, Evelyn." The room spun. She clenched her fists, trying to block out the horrifying words, the sickening ease with which he spoke them. "No," she whispered. Darius took another step closer. "You don't have to fight it. You're a part of this too. Blood calls to blood." His voice was hypnotic, crawling under her skin like 1,000 writhing insects. For a second, just a second, she saw it. The possibility. Her mother, alive again, whole, waiting for her. But then she saw the truth. This wasn't about love. It never had been. Darius didn't love her mother. He didn't love anyone. He was a parasite, feeding on suffering, twisting the past into something unrecognizable. Evelyn's fingers brushed against a shard of broken glass on the nearby shelf. She gripped it tight, feeling the sting as it cut into her palm. Darius reached for her. She struck. The glass plunged into his side, deep and brutal. Darius let out a choked gasp, staggering backward. His eyes widened in shock, surprise, even, before dark amusement flickered across his face. "Good girl," he rasped. Evelyn yanked the shard free, and Darius crumpled to the floor. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing, ragged and uneven. She took a step back, gripping the bloodied glass like a lifeline. And then, a whisper of movement. She blinked. Darius's body was gone. A slow, creeping horror crawled up her spine as a familiar voice slithered through the air. "You can't kill what's already dead." The lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness. The silence in the asylum was suffocating, thick with the weight of something unseen. Evelyn's breath came in short, uneven gasps as she clutched the bloodied shard of glass in her trembling hand. Sheriff Grayson, pale and grimacing from his wounds, leaned heavily against a rusted metal cabinet, his eyes darting around the darkened hallway. "He's gone," Grayson muttered. "How the hell did he just—" Evelyn shook her head. She didn't have an answer. She didn't want one. The air felt wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally in the dim, flickering light. And then, footsteps. Soft. Slow. Just beyond the doorway. Evelyn turned sharply, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Darius?" she whispered, but the name tasted like poison on her tongue. The footsteps stopped. Then came the whispering. A chorus of voices, layered over each other, hissing from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around them. Some were distorted, as if spoken from beneath water, others low and guttural, like something ancient. Grayson reached for his gun with a shaking hand. "Tell me you hear that." Evelyn nodded, swallowing hard. "He's still here." They moved cautiously through the asylum's crumbling corridors, the air thick with decay and something far worse, something unseen but present. Every so often, Evelyn caught glimpses of movement in the corners of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing. Then they found the basement door. It was hidden behind a rusted metal cabinet, almost as if someone had tried to seal it away from the rest of the building. But the lock had long since been broken. Evelyn hesitated. "We have to go down there." Grayson exhaled sharply. "Of course we do." They descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing against damp stone walls. The further they went, the colder it became, as though the air itself rejected the presence of the living. At the bottom of the stairs, the room opened into something Evelyn could only describe as a shrine. The walls were covered in occult symbols, drawn in blackened, dried blood. Bones were arranged in intricate patterns, and in the center of it all stood a coffin, draped in deep crimson fabric, surrounded by melted candle wax and offerings of decayed flowers. Evelyn's stomach twisted violently. She took a step forward, reaching out. The coffin was old, but the wood was still intact, its surface carved with the same runes she had seen throughout the asylum. Grayson exhaled through his teeth. "Tell me we're not about to open that." But Evelyn already knew. She had to. With steady hands, she pressed her fingers to the lid and pushed. The wood groaned in protest before giving way. Inside, lying in eerie preservation, was a woman's body. Evelyn gasped, stumbling back. The woman's face was serene, untouched by time. Her hands folded neatly over her chest. Her dress was tattered and stained, but beneath the dust and decay, Evelyn could still make out the resemblance. Darius's mother. The whispers grew louder, slithering through the room like a rising tide. Then, the candles flickered once, twice, and blew out. Darkness swallowed them whole. And from the pitch black, a voice. Darius's voice, echoed from everywhere at once. "You can't stop me." The darkness was suffocating. Evelyn's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as the last echoes of Darius's voice faded into the void. Sheriff Grayson fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers trembling against the cold metal, but before he could switch it on, an eerie glow began to pulse from the coffin. Evelyn turned back, her eyes widening. The light was coming from beneath the body, illuminating the cracks in the wood with an unnatural, shifting red hue. With hesitant fingers, she reached inside and found something wedged beneath the corpse's delicate hands. A leather-bound diary, brittle with age. She pulled it free, the pages crackling as she flipped through them. The ink had faded, but the words still held power. Darius's mother had written this, chronicling her descent into the occult. He was born under the blood moon, marked by something ancient. I tried to cleanse him, but the voices whispered of his destiny. The ritual must be completed, or he will be neither dead nor living. A shadow bound to this earth, waiting, hungering. Evelyn's stomach twisted. The curse didn't just make Darius dangerous, it made him immortal. A sudden creak from behind. Evelyn stiffened, the diary slipping from her fingers. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She turned, dread tightening around her throat like a noose. Darius stood in the doorway. His wounds were gone. Not even a trace of blood stained his skin. His lips curled into a smile, but there was something wrong about it. Too wide, too knowing. His eyes gleamed with amusement as he tilted his head. "You're part of this now," he whispered. Before Evelyn could react, he lunged. Pain exploded in her skull as everything went black. She woke to the sound of steady, rhythmic dripping. Her arms and legs were bound, coarse rope biting into her skin. The air was damp, thick with the metallic tang of blood. The room was pitch black, but Evelyn could hear movement, the sound of something sharp scraping against stone. Then, a flicker of light. Darius stood before her, a rusted blade in one hand, his fingers tracing the tip absent-mindedly. Behind him, Strange symbols were scrawled across the walls in what she knew wasn't just paint. "You should feel honored," Darius murmured, crouching beside her. His breath was warm against her cheek. "You were always meant to be here. Always meant to be part of this." Evelyn struggled, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Let me go, you." Darius pressed a finger to her lips, shushing her. "I promise it won't hurt. Not at first." Then he lifted the blade. Evelyn's scream was swallowed by the dark. Evelyn's body throbbed with pain as the cold steel bit into her skin. Darius worked with slow, deliberate precision, carving the intricate symbol into her arm. Blood trickled down in thin rivulets, mixing with the dark stains already covering the stone floor. "You were always meant for this," he murmured, his voice reverent. "The sixth sacrifice, the one who will finally open the gate." Evelyn clenched her teeth against the burning pain. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Her fingers twitched, subtly feeling for the sharp edge of glass she had hidden beneath her palm. The moment Darius loosened his grip, she struck. The shard sliced through the ropes at her wrist. Ignoring the searing pain in her arm, Evelyn lunged. The force of her attack sent Darius stumbling back, but he recovered quickly, eyes burning with something almost inhuman. "You can't stop it," he hissed, lunging for her. Evelyn grabbed the nearest weapon, rusted ritual dagger lying beside the altar. Without thinking, she drove it into his chest. Darius gasped, his body jerking as the blade sank deep. His fingers trembled against the hilt, his breath coming in ragged, uneven bursts. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the room trembled. A deep, guttural rumbling echoed from the walls, the symbols on the floor pulsing with an eerie, unnatural light. Shadows slithered across the ground like living things, twisting and writhing in anticipation. Evelyn staggered back, her heart hammering. Darius's lips curled into a bloody smile. "You think you stopped it?" His voice was weak, but triumphant. "You completed it." The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen. The light in the room dimmed, consumed by encroaching darkness. Evelyn's stomach lurched as the realization hit her. She hadn't ended the ritual. She had triggered it. The air in the asylum turned thick and suffocating, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. A low whispering filled the space, a chorus of voices rising in agony and rage. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps as she stepped back from Darius's lifeless body. Or at least, what should have been lifeless. His eyes remained open, glassy yet triumphant, as if even in death, he had won. Then the first hand broke through the stone floor. A rotted, skeletal limb clawed its way upward, followed by another. The walls trembled as more hands emerged, the ground splitting apart as spirits pulled themselves free from their shallow graves. Evelyn's body went rigid as she saw their faces. The victims of Darius, men, women, even children, rose from the earth, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Their bodies were twisted and broken, some with gaping wounds that still dripped with spectral blood. Their whispers turned to screams. "Justice! Vengeance! Make him pay!" Evelyn turned and ran. The asylum's hallways twisted around her, the walls stretching and bending as if the building itself was alive. Each step echoed as the spirits surged forward, their movements erratic, their rage unyielding. She skidded to a stop as she saw them, Lila and Sheriff Grayson, cornered in the main hall. The spirits surrounded them, closing in like a pack of wolves. Grayson's face was pale, his body still weak from his wounds, but his grip on his revolver was steady, useless against the dead. Lila clung to him, her tear-streaked face twisted in terror. "Evelyn!" Grayson shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising wails. Evelyn's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this. Then she saw it, the glowing symbol carved into the stone floor. The very same one Darius had tried to complete with her blood. The spirits didn't want her. They wanted justice. And the curse, the nightmare, was tied to the symbol. Evelyn's stomach twisted as the truth became clear. If she wanted to end this, she had to destroy the symbol. But could she do it before the spirits took their revenge? A wave of heat and energy pulsed through the asylum as the flames consumed the cursed symbol. The eerie glow of the mark flickered, its lines cracking like brittle glass beneath the fire's wrath. Evelyn stood over it, her heart pounding, her breath ragged. The spirits shrieked, their wails of agony filling the chamber. They convulsed, their twisted forms flickering between solid and smoke, as if the fire had severed their tether to the mortal world. Grayson lay on the ground, barely holding himself up, blood dripping from fresh wounds. He had thrown himself between Evelyn and the vengeful dead, buying her just enough time. His gun was empty, his strength fading. Evelyn clenched her fists as she watched the spirits writhe. It was working. The curse was breaking. Then the air turned cold. A gust of wind snuffed out the flames in an instant, the darkness rushing back like an exhaled breath. A deep, guttural laugh echoed from the shadows. Evelyn's stomach twisted as the fire's glow receded, revealing a towering form rising from the cracked floor. Darius. But he was no longer human. His once pale skin was now blackened like charred flesh, his eyes glowing embers of hate. His wounds had vanished, replaced by jagged veins of darkness pulsing beneath his skin. The ritual chamber pulsed with an unnatural energy, the ground shifting under his power. You really thought it would be that easy? His voice was distorted, layered with something ancient. Evelyn staggered back, her fingers tightening around the empty gasoline canister. The spirits had weakened, their forms flickering like dying flames, but Darius, he was something else now, something worse. He stepped toward her, his shadow stretching unnaturally, swallowing the light. The fire had cracked the symbol, but it had also unleashed him. The air in the asylum grew thick with darkness, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Darius's new form loomed over Evelyn, his body a shifting mass of smoke and ember, his eyes burning with malice. Shadows slithered from his fingers, reaching for her like living tendrils. Evelyn gripped the ritual dagger, her knuckles white. She lunged, slashing through the shadows, but the blade passed through his form like mist. Darius let out a guttural laugh, his voice echoing from every direction at once. "You can't kill what is already dead," he whispered, his voice slithering into her ears. A shadow lashed out, wrapping around Evelyn's throat and lifting her off the ground. She gasped, clawing at the tendrils, but they were cold, suffocating, draining the warmth from her body. Then, a voice rang out from behind her. "Evelyn, I found something." Lila. She stood in the asylum's ruined library, an ancient tome clutched in her hands. The book's pages glowed with a faint golden light, the words etched in a language older than time. She flipped through frantically, her hands shaking. "There's a banishment spell, but I need to." Darius turned, his shadows lashing toward Lila. Evelyn acted on instinct. Using the last of her strength, she drove the dagger into the ground, piercing what remained of the cracked symbol. A shockwave pulsed through the asylum, making the shadows recoil just long enough for her to drop to the floor. Lila took the chance. She began to chant the incantation, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. The air shimmered, a golden light breaking through the darkness. Darius snarled. His form flickered, the shadows around him convulsing. "No," he growled, his voice shifting between human and something monstrous. "You will not take this from me." He lunged at Lila. Evelyn threw herself in front of him. The world tilted. Cold, suffocating darkness swallowed her whole. Darius's grip tightened around her wrist, his twisted grin inches from her face. "If I go," he whispered, pulling her into the abyss, "you're coming with me." The shadows coiled around Evelyn like hungry serpents, pulling her deeper into the abyss with Darius. His grip tightened, his fingers ice cold against her skin. Lila's voice rang out, chanting the incantation, but the spell wasn't strong enough. Darius wasn't just lingering, he was anchored. Evelyn's mind raced. The ritual, the blood, the sacrifices. Darius wasn't the key to breaking the curse. She was. With a sharp breath, she pulled the ritual dagger from her belt and slashed across her palm. Warm blood dripped onto the ground, sizzling as it met the cursed floor. The air vibrated. A surge of energy shot through the asylum, making the walls tremble. Darius's eyes widened. No. Evelyn gritted her teeth, forcing the words from her lips. Ex tenebris, redit in nihilum. The moment the final syllable left her mouth, the shadows convulsed. A deafening roar erupted from the void as the darkness twisted in on itself. Darius screamed, his body splitting into shreds of black smoke, his form stretching impossibly thin. No, this isn't over. His voice distorted, breaking into static before vanishing into nothingness. The darkness imploded, pulling the remains of the ritual chamber with it. The asylum groaned, walls cracking as the very foundation of its cursed existence began to unravel. Evelyn stumbled back, her vision blurring. Evelyn, we have to go. Lila's hands gripped her shoulders, shaking her back to reality. The floor crumbled beneath them. They ran, dodging falling beams and bursts of fire as the asylum collapsed around them. The main doors were barely holding on, swinging wildly in the chaos. With one final leap, they burst through the entrance just as the building gave its final death rattle. The asylum caved in, sending a plume of dust and smoke into the night sky. Silence followed. The nightmare was over. Gasping for breath, Evelyn and Lila stumbled to the car, their bodies bruised and exhausted. Lila turned the key, and the engine roared to life. They sped away, the ruins of Black Hollow Asylum disappearing in the rearview mirror. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn allowed herself to exhale. But just as she closed her eyes, something caught her attention. Resting on the seat beside her was a single, black feather. A chill crawled down her spine. Darius's final words echoed in her mind. This isn't over. The scars of Black Hollow Asylum weren't just physical. They had settled deep into Evelyn's soul. She and Lila had survived, but survival didn't mean freedom. The weight of what they had seen, what they had done, clung to them like a second skin. Sleep was a luxury Evelyn could no longer afford. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Darius's face, heard his final scream, felt the shadows clawing at her. They had driven through the night, not stopping until the cursed ruins were miles behind them. But no distance could erase the memories. Back in town, Evelyn wasted no time. She put everything into words. Every horrific detail of Darius's reign of terror, every crime hidden beneath the asylum's rotting walls. Her article shook the town to its core. Reporters swarmed the area. Investigators exhumed long-buried secrets. The name Darius Holloway became a ghost story whispered in fear. But then, the letters started. The first one arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope, slipped under her door in the dead of night. You should have left it buried. Inside, a single black feather. More followed. Some left in her mailbox. Others tucked under her windshield wipers. The message remained the same. Stop digging. Stop remembering. Stop writing. Lila begged her to let it go. Whatever's out there, Evelyn, it doesn't want us to talk about him. But Evelyn couldn't stop. Wouldn't. Not until she knew the truth. The final warning came on a cold, gray morning. Evelyn stood at Sheriff Grayson's grave, the wind biting through her coat. She traced her fingers over his name, guilt gnawing at her. He had sacrificed himself to stop Darius, to save them. But had they really won? A shadow fell over the grave. Her breath hitched. Lying on the freshly turned soil was a black feather, and beneath it, carved deep into the stone, was the same twisted symbol from the ritual chamber. Evelyn's heart pounded. Someone had been here. Someone was still watching. The wind carried a sound, soft, deliberate footsteps. She turned slowly. A figure stood at the edge of the trees. Tall, unmoving, shrouded in darkness. Watching, waiting. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Darius was dead, but his legacy was far from over. Fear was an old companion now. Evelyn had lived with it for so long that it no longer startled her. It merely settled deeper into her bones. But standing before Sheriff Grayson's grave, staring at the carved symbol, she felt something new. This wasn't fear. This was inevitability. The symbol was fresh, its edges sharp against the cold stone. Someone had carved it recently. And it wasn't just a warning. It was a piece of something bigger. Evelyn spent the next 2 days locked in research, poring over her notes, old books, anything that could explain why Darius's presence lingered. She traced the markings back to an ancient ritual, something far darker than she had initially believed. Darius hadn't just wanted immortality. He had achieved it. His soul had been tethered to the mortal world through these symbols, spread across the town like a map. Each one was a beacon, drawing him back, making him stronger. Destroying the ritual chamber had only been the beginning. But where were the rest? Evelyn didn't have to wait long to find out. That evening, she returned home, exhausted and unsettled. As she stepped into her bedroom, something felt wrong. The air was heavier. The shadows stretched unnaturally. Then she saw it. The door to her closet was open, just a crack. Her breath hitched. She never left it open. A terrible dread settled in her stomach as she stepped closer, her fingers trembling as she pushed the door wide. Behind her clothes, a false wall had been removed, revealing a hidden room she had never known existed. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and it was filled with him, Darius's belongings. His old, tattered journals, photographs of the asylum, his ritual notes. But the worst was on the far wall. Rows of photographs pinned in a precise, obsessive order. All of them were of her. Some from years ago, before she had ever stepped foot into Black Hollow Asylum. Others were recent, some taken outside her home, others from inside. One of them showed her sleeping. A cold, invisible hand gripped her throat. He had been watching, waiting, always. A sound shattered the silence, a low rustling, like breath against the walls. Evelyn spun, her heart pounding. A figure loomed in the darkness, its shape shifting, swirling, stretching. A whisper slithered through the air, as cold as death. "Did you miss me?" The shadow lunged. Evelyn barely dodged, grabbing the first thing she could, a rusted lamp from the desk, swinging it wildly. It passed through the figure like smoke. Cold fingers grazed her arm, and a searing pain shot through her skin. Evelyn scrambled back, reaching for the door. But the shadows moved with her, pulling at her limbs, dragging her down. She kicked, fought, screamed, until suddenly, the pressure lifted. The darkness receded. The room was silent. But when she turned to her bed, her stomach twisted into a knot of ice. A note sat neatly on her pillow, written in an all-too-familiar hand. "You can't escape me." The night was heavy with silence as Evelyn stood before the ruins of Black Hollow Asylum. The once imposing structure was now a skeletal husk, its walls blackened with decay, its windows shattered like gaping mouths. The place reeked of death and time, of things that refused to stay buried. She had one last task. The curse wasn't just Darius's doing. His power had come from something older, darker. His mother had bound him to this world with a ritual that defied death itself, using her own remains as the anchor. As long as they remained intact, so would he. Evelyn clutched the ritual dagger tightly as she stepped through the broken doorway. The asylum greeted her with an oppressive stillness, the air thick with the ghosts of the past. The walls bore deep claw marks, remnants of the tortured souls who had once wandered its halls. She moved carefully, her footsteps echoing against the cracked tiles. She knew exactly where to go. The basement, the place where it had all begun. As she descended the rotting stairs, the air grew colder. The shadows moved differently here, thick and alive, stretching toward her with unseen hands. She tightened her grip on the dagger. The coffin sat at the center of the ritual chamber, its wood darkened with age, the symbols surrounding it pulsing faintly. Darius's mother had been dead for decades, but her influence remained. Evelyn stepped forward. Then the room shifted. The shadows thickened, swirling like living tendrils, coiling around her ankles. A voice whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't have come back." Evelyn's breath hitched as the air turned frigid. The shadows condensed, forming into something more human. Darius stood before her. His face was no longer the smooth, calculated mask she had known. Now, it was a writhing mass of darkness, his features shifting in and out of focus. His eyes, black voids, locked onto her, burning with rage. "I offered you a place beside me," he growled. "You could have been part of something eternal." Evelyn swallowed the terror clawing at her throat. "I'd rather die." His lips twisted into something that might have been a smile. That can be arranged. He lunged. Evelyn barely dodged, rolling across the floor as the shadows lashed toward her. Her fingers scraped against the cold stone as she scrambled to her feet, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had to act fast. With a desperate cry, she swung the ritual dagger downward, straight into the coffin. The blade plunged into the brittle remains within, shattering bone, piercing deep into the heart of the ritual. The reaction was immediate. A scream erupted through the chamber, a sound so inhuman it rattled the walls. The symbols burned a violent red, then cracked apart, the light spilling from them like molten fire. Darius convulsed, his body flickering, warping. His hands stretched toward her, but they were disintegrating, crumbling into wisps of smoke. "No!" he roared, his voice distorted, desperate. Evelyn watched as his form twisted violently, the darkness peeling away like a dying flame. The void was swallowing him whole. His eyes locked onto hers one last time, something unreadable flickering within their black depths. Then he was gone. The room collapsed into silence. The shadows no longer moved. The air no longer whispered. It was over. Evelyn stood there, breathless, staring at the smoldering remains of the coffin. The weight that had pressed against her chest for so long was suddenly gone, leaving behind only exhaustion. She stumbled back up the stairs, into the cool night air. The asylum stood eerily quiet behind her, nothing more than an abandoned ruin now. She exhaled, relief washing over her. Then the wind shifted. A whisper brushed against her ear, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "This isn't over." The fresh scent of pine and damp earth filled the air as Evelyn stepped onto the porch of her new home. The town was small, quiet, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night, where the shadows didn't whisper secrets. It was exactly what she and Lila needed after everything they had been through. It had been 6 months since Black Hollow, since the asylum, since Darius. Evelyn had done everything to convince herself it was over. She had burned the symbol, destroyed the remains, and left that cursed place behind. But the past had a way of clinging to her, creeping into the corners of her mind like a lingering sickness. She saw it in Lila's eyes too, the way she jumped at shadows, the way her hands trembled when the wind howled through the trees. They were safe now, weren't they? Evelyn closed her eyes and exhaled, pushing the thought away. She turned back inside, where her desk was cluttered with scattered notes and a half-written manuscript. She was writing again. A book, detailing everything. The town's secrets. Darius's reign of terror. The ritual that had almost claimed her life. But every time she tried to finish, something stopped her. A feeling. A whisper at the back of her mind. Some things should stay buried. She shook it off and sat down, fingers hovering over the keyboard. But just as she began to type, a tap, tap, tap echoed from the front door. Her heart lurched. It was late. No one should be here. Slowly, she rose, making her way to the entrance. She hesitated, fingers trembling as they reached for the handle. Then she swung the door open. Nothing. The street was empty, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying the scent of rain. Evelyn exhaled a shaky breath. Get it together. Then she saw it, lying on the welcome mat. A single, black feather. Cold dread coiled around her spine. She stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. The world around her dimmed, narrowing to that small, innocent-looking thing. A trick of the wind. A coincidence. That's all. But deep down, she knew better. A noise came from behind her, a soft creak, the sound of a floorboard shifting. Evelyn spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. But the air inside felt heavier, thicker, as if something unseen had followed her in. She swallowed hard, stepping back and locking the door. Her gaze flickered to the window, to the dense tree line beyond. The wind moved the branches, swaying them back and forth. But there, just at the edge of the trees, something else moved. A figure. Tall. Still. Watching. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't see his face, but she knew. She didn't need to see. Her lips parted, a whisper barely escaping into the stillness of the night. He's still out there. The wind howled. The lights flickered. And then, Blackness,